Okay, so I've still been thinking more about the distinction between reading books and watching videos, and I don't want to overdraw the distinction. I mean, sometimes it becomes easy to just overstate the case and become reductive one way or the other, but I want to see if I can't talk about, I guess I'll call it the logic that you can identify within either. And I think part of the issue for me is that when I was young, I grew up thinking that books were novels or books were stories. And that's really, I didn't have, I had very little exposure to books as a youth. I wasn't around books that much. But the few books that I was around, I just always got the assumption that they were stories or novels or, something of this sort. And I never really had an appeal for any of that. It just seemed boring, or I didn't really get the point, and I've read, I guess later in life I've read a fair amount of literature now at this point, and there are people who I like. I really do like Dostoevsky. If anybody's never read Clockwork Orange, you get to learn a little Russian slang. There are some, I guess, books that are interesting, even though for my own tastes they're a little more literature and focused in narrative than in, I guess, theoretical or philosophical or conceptual work. And I guess when I was young, it was a real discovery to realize how different books are and how many different kinds of books there are. And I guess I increasingly started to realize that, again, there are things that books allow one to do to organize thoughts, and I want to see if I can maybe draw that. And I don't want to overdraw the comparison, right? It's easy to overstate it, but try to think of it this way: that that texts. Boy, how do you say this? Okay, so a novel unfolds across its pages, but what it's trying to represent is something like an unfolding in time. That is, there was a certain sequence of events in the world, either real or imagined, and then those get represented in the narrative story or in a novel, and in doing so, there's a kind of parallelism between the growth and development of the story and the actual growth and development of the plot line and the way that it unfolds in the text. And by that I mean you read the book from the front to the back. And if it's a mystery, it's even more evident. But in many stories, there's build-ups and crescendos, and it's almost as if you build up an understanding that slowly reveals what's happening, and it grows thicker and thicker. But the events themselves, they unfold one at a time after one another. And again, the narrative is good for capturing that ebb and flow, that rise and fall of various, I guess, sets of relations, and the resolve that comes from, I guess, various problems or crises or dilemmas that people faced. It's so different than a theoretical book, a conceptual book, a scholarly work. And I thought I have a big stack here. Now, I'm not going to obviously go through all these, beginners books, right? There are a big stack of them. And I'm going to tell you right now, I think most of them are really crappy. They're really bad. They're badly thought out. Many of them are not very good representatives of the thinkers or the traditions that they're after. I think some of it is too difficult because the concepts are too nebulous. They're not really. Some of them really weren't that good. The three that I think are excellent, outstanding, really worth getting, the two that were done by Daniel D. Palmer are great. This one here called, Structuralism and Post-Structuralism. That's this one. That's that one. And the other one here is the Kierkegaard for Beginners. Both of these are really exceptional. Not only are the cartoons witty and to the point and interesting, but the actual text, the person who did the writing of it, they have really good command over Kierkegaard as well as the meaning of structuralism, post-structuralism. I can't recommend both of these books enough. The best book in the beginner series, from my own perspective, is The Sartre for Beginners. If no one has, if you don't have this, if you haven't seen it, go get yourself a copy. This is certainly, I don't think there is a better simple introduction to Sartre. Now, you could go get Transcendence of the Ego. I mean, that's a really wonderful little essay from him. Or you could get his book, Psychology of Imagination, I think is really good. If you want to see his orientation toward Marxist thought and his struggle, you want to get Search for Method. Being in Nothingness is a masterpiece, but it's very difficult. You know, it's very time-consuming. This is just so wonderful. You know, it mixes so many of all of Sartre's books and the concepts and ideas, but puts them into a very witty and accessible format here. But some of the things I want to get at here is some of the things that's interesting about a conceptual book like this. And another book that I'll say, you know, is one of my favorite books. I've talked about this book before, called Rhetoric of Religion. This is by Kenneth Burke. And you know, he's got a diagram in here. Again, it's very, very interesting diagram. I don't know if we can see all that. But this diagram, I think, sort of it typifies or exemplifies what I'm talking about when I talk about a book. Okay, so see if I can get at some of this. Now, I don't want to overdo it, because I think sometimes the science narrative can make sense. But try to think of the periodic chart of the elements. You know, if you look at a chart right there, there's the periodic chart, and there's all the elements. Now, someone might try to tell a narrative about which ones came first and how they evolved and developed, but there's another sense in which right now in the world we encounter the simultaneous presence of all of them. They're all simultaneously present. And then the question is, well, how are they related? How are they aligned? How do they interact? And what is the nature of, I guess, all of the possible relations given the elements that are there? And I think those are the kinds of books that I'm interested in. Like, by analogy, I mean, take a book like Sartre. That is, you don't have to read this from the beginning to the end. And in fact, you're not progressing and developing in a one-way setup that is if you're trying to, in time, represent the unfolding that occurred in time. No, what's happening is, you know, a philosopher or a thinker, a theorist, they will construct a kind of system, and the system will have elements which are simultaneous to one another, and you need the text discursively because there's no way to present simultaneous ideas. I mean, short of having some, you know, some diagram that just has all of the elements there simultaneously. But even there, you have to look at it. You have to study it. You have to think about it. You have to kind of go into what is implied here. How do all of these elements relate? And so the kind of reading that I think I'm really interested in is first off, you don't have a highlighter. Whenever I see students or people with a highlighter, I think, what are they thinking? Do they think the answer's right there and they're highlighting it? There's the point. No, you get a fine pen. I myself always enjoy the Zebra F301 BP. Whatever, you get a nice fine point pen, and you sit down. You got your feet on the floor, and you don't just highlight something. You'll underline something. Maybe you'll double underline it if it's a key term. If you don't know it, maybe you'll circle the term and write the definition in the side. You might make numerical points. You might write, you know, this is BS or other criticisms in the side. I mean, you might actually start to write along the side of the text. You might start to map the text where you're going to write in what's point 1, what's point 2, what's an example of point 2, and then you're going to say CF 3 pages from now where the critique of this ends. And the more that you learn to critically interact with your text, I guess you start to represent and try to get a handle on the thought system of that author or that thinker. And it's like certain books, you know, again, I can't recommend, you know, to really get into Sartre's work. You know, I think to try to get at the degree to which a book enables for the systematic study of simultaneity. So there's all these ideas that are simultaneous to each other, all these ideas that somehow relate to one another in Sartre's work. It's things about bad faith, it's about freedom, it's about choice, it's about nothingness, it's about anxiety and desire. All these again, very, very basic concepts, how they all relate to one another. And it's not as if it's a narrative where it's one thing folding after the other. Instead, the book takes on a discursive form. It goes from one thing to the next because it's very difficult to talk about the much-at-onceness of a whole system of ideas without making recourse to some step-by-step flow through with it. But you can read a book, a conceptual book, and by that I mean not a novel, not a story, but like a theorist's book. You can read it backward. You can read the last essay and then the second last essay and then the first essay, and you can hop back and forth. And maybe as you start to take notes, suddenly the whole crystallizes upon you. Now, maybe you can do this in a novel, and I've had some literature classes where you try to identify key themes. You're going to talk about the turtle crossing the road and the grapes of wrath, and what does Daisy mean in the Fitzgerald's I can't even think of I just lost the name of the book. People know what I'm talking about. Again, these sort of classics of literature, and I think those are fine. If people want to do that, it seems so different though than a conceptual work. I can't get it out of my. It's not Great Gatsby. So people can do that. People can try to look for themes and identify that, but it seems so different than the kind of simultaneity that a conceptual work offers, and the kind of study that's required in that. And I think this is part of, I'm giving this very long roundabout, but it seems like a video. Now, a video can have a schematic, and it can have a schematic that's up there and can talk about it and really help analyze the sort of much-at-onceness of all of the ideas that are related there. And so there is a lot to be said about some video presentations and how they're able to do that. But so many videos, they don't allow for back scanning. They don't allow you to pause and to circle words. They don't allow for the flipping back and forth. You have to watch it in one direction. You can't watch a video backward, but you can back scan through a text. I think sometimes as we're talking even, there's a narrative flow in arguments that it makes them maybe more persuasive, more coherent, but if you'd hear it backward, or if you'd come at it the other way, it really wouldn't make sense. But some texts, if they're really well thought out, and the person is trying to convey a coherent system of thought, they do hang together. See, it's sort of like the difference between geometry, where all of the elements are simultaneous there, even if they're corollaries and they have to be sort of drawn out, they were implicated always right there at the beginning. Once you talk about the existence of parallel lines, and once you set up some basic axioms, all of the rest just follows, and you can explore it and follow it out, but they were simultaneous to those axioms. And I think that some of the video orientation, it leads to a one at a time a flow that really covers over the building up of thought that comes from study. That is, someone who only watches videos, I don't know if they're ever going to be able to systematically build up what a thinker's orientation is, in the way that if you'd study that person's work, or again, even a secondary source. I very rarely recommend secondary sources, but when you look at a book and you try to study it, there's a creating of a structure of a simultaneity of relations, which is so different than, I guess, what the bulk of video is, and what so many novels and or narratives are. So those are some thoughts. Okay, thanks.